Hello everybody, another day, another Ferrari. I know, I'm a martyr to the cause. Anyway, this one is rather interesting because it, I think, could be considered as one of the most important cars the firm has ever made, and yet, for the entirety of its life, it's also been considered one of the least desirable. Well, I think maybe now that should change. This is the 308 GT4. Like myself, you've only come into either the world itself or the world of Ferraris in the last few decades, you'll likely see this car and go, oh yeah, I've seen a few of those about. They're the horrid old cheap ones that aren't actually really even a proper Ferrari, are they? And I suppose in some ways that is correct. However, now, knowing Ferraris a little bit more, actually, there is a lot that makes this a very, very special vehicle, even in the illustrious company of the prancing horse. Now, first things first, yes, it is true, when these originally rolled out of the factory gates down at Maranello in 1973, they were not badged as a Ferrari. Nowhere on them would you have found the prancing horse, because this was sold for the first 3 years of its life as a Dino, finally only becoming a Ferrari in 1976. And that makes this already a very, very interesting car. Now, some of you may have seen the piece that Jason Camissa did recently on the Dino legacy, a piece that I was quoted many, many times when I did a couple of videos where I cited the fact that the old Dinos weren't considered proper Ferraris because they didn't have V12s in them. Now, I may do a whole video talking about this exact topic, but up until that point, no Ferrari road-going car had less than 12 cylinders in it. The Dino, though, was Ferrari's way of kind of dipping their toes into the water of slightly more mass production, because Ferrari, like essentially all of their peers, Aston Martin, Lamborghini, and even to some extent Porsche, had a reputation for making great cars, but they were not great business people. And so they realised that they needed simply to sell more cars if they wanted to stay in the car-making game. And even today, this is still very much true. Without the Cayenne, without the Macan, we wouldn't have a 911 GT3. Although, I don't think I'm going to go as far as saying that without the Puro Sangue, we wouldn't have a 296, because that, I think, is simply not true. It is, though, perhaps true to say that without the Urus, Lamborghini might no longer be an Audi concern. And at the point of filming, they've just announced that their new baby Lambo is going to get a 10,000 RPM V8. Very much looking forward to seeing what that's like. Anyhow, the future does sound, I think, very, very interesting and in some ways exciting, but let's wind the clock back again, shall we, to the past. And this was a notable car for very, very many reasons, not simply because it was the second to wear the Dino badging, following on from the 206, which morphed into the 246, a car that gained a reputation very, very early on for being one of the prettiest that Ferrari, or indeed anyone, had ever made. And though I've never been quite as fascinated by it as, say, my dad has been, I can see it. It's a very elegant and shapely thing. But it did have a V6 in the back of it, and even today a V6 in the back of a car, well, yes, it's nice, but it's not supercar nice. Especially, I think, in America, you would have had a hard time selling an exotic with a 6. Let's face it, milk floats over there have big Hemi V8s in them, so trying to convince somebody to spend 10 times the amount of money on something with a 6, good luck. I am, of course, being a touch facetious here, but I think the overall sentiment is still very much true. And so, for the next step in his Dino lineup, Enzo brought this, the 308 GT4. And it was the first 2+2-seater that Ferrari made with the engine in the back. Most excitingly, this is the first car they made for the road with a V8 in it. It displaced 2.9 litres, originally had 2 valves per cylinder, and made in its first guise 240 horsepower. It is fed by a brace of carburetors and had a very, very long life. In fact, descendants of this engine saw service all the way until the 360. So this power plant, which began life in 1973, actually only retired in 2004. Now, by that time, of course, it was a very different thing. It had rotated 90 degrees in the engine bay. This is transverse, in part to allow the 2+2 layout, but also because that's what people did. Remember, the Miura had a transversely mounted 12, so a transverse 8 really was a fairly simple affair. By the end of its life, capacity had also risen to 3.6 litres, and in the Challenge Stradale, it made 425 horsepower. Not bad. And it did all of that while making a fantastic noise. And of course, don't forget, if you're thinking about buying yourself a 45-year-old classic Ferrari, make sure to use CarVertical, because all of these cars have a history. You just want to make sure it's a good one. In 60 seconds, with either a registration plate or a VIN number, CarVertical will tell you all sorts of very, very handy stuff. And even better, if you use my discount code JAYEMM, you'll get 20% off the service. But what I think is really quite interesting about this car is that maybe even because it was such a big deal, such an important thing for Ferrari, they hired an entirely new styling house. They didn't go to their favourites, Pininfarina, who by that time they'd already been using for quite a while. Instead, they went to their rivals, Bertone, and they got Marcello Gandini, much loved for his work over at Lamborghini, to give them a design. And he did. And it looked suspiciously like the Lancia Stratos and the Lamborghini Huracan of the day. And maybe because of that, Ferrari never went back to him. Now, I've got to be honest, I've never really felt like this was much of a looker. And I feel the same way about the later Mondial, which confusingly and frustratingly and annoyingly I reviewed in the past. But in front of me, and with a few subtle cosmetic modifications, I think it's still of its time, but I don't dislike it. I certainly don't hate it for the way that it looks. It also, much like the Mondial, when you get a nice piece of open road, does give you that real Ferrari feeling. If you want to do anything more than just look at it, I think it's fairly safe to say that any old Ferrari, maybe any Ferrari, is always going to be a labour of love. And that is certainly true for Alistair and his 308 GT4. Now, this is actually a very, very late example of the model from 1980, the final year of production, by which time the factory had chucked out nearly 3,000 of these and about 800 of the smaller engined 208 GT4, designed primarily for the Italian market and their displacement-based tax regulations. Now, Alistair has had this car for over 20 years, in which time he has done over 50,000 miles, bringing the grand total up to over 106,000. Good man. He's also made many, many fond memories, but has decided now is the time for him to move it on. And his replacement really is, I think, very appropriate. He's bought a Lotus Emira. In many ways, the Evora is sort of the spiritual successor to stuff like this. I mean, how many mid-engine 2+2 cars have there been throughout history? The answer is not many. And though the Emira is no longer a 2+2, it still has the same chassis and very much the same sort of feel that he gets from this. And so he's enjoying that, but still using this. And I'm very, very glad and grateful that he's offered it to me, because it's very clear to me that this is a car that has had an awful lot of love thrown its way. Now, when he first picked this up, just after the turn of the millennium, like many GT4s, it was in need of quite a bit of work. and he spent 4 years doing everything that he could trying to restore it to as correct as original condition, making some modifications along the way. So the engine, for example, is now overboard and displaces more like 3.1 litres than the original 2.9. The 308 designation was always a little bit optimistic. Things like the fueling in particular have been a labour of love, and he has spent an awful long time getting everything absolutely spot on. But after he'd first rebuilt it, done all that work, he took it out and he hated it. He really, really didn't like it. It was soft, it was wallowy, the whole thing just didn't feel right, and it didn't put a smile on his face. But rather than give up, he thought, right, this is an old school car and it's a fairly mechanically simple car. I reckon if there's a problem, I can fix it. And so that is what he started doing. The suspension has been thoroughly reworked. Steel bushes and rose joints have come in place of the original rubber ones. The Koni shocks have been replaced by gas items. The ride height has been set so that it still sits nice and purposefully, but doesn't smack into the floor at every opportunity as it apparently did in original guise. The car also now has electronic ignition, something that I advocate for all classic cars, because while I can see absolutely why somebody would maintain carbs, they've got a beautiful sound and character all of their own. Points? Well, I just don't really see the point. Forgive me the terrible pun. And let's be honest here, 1970s and 80s cars, people didn't leave them alone, did they? You put wheels on, you put different bits on, you put silly body kits and things on. Heck, you put Webastos in cars. So if you lived through the 70s and you think what modern kids do to cars, well, I'm sorry. I haven't seen anyone take a pair of tin snips to the roof of their car for quite some time. Now, I mentioned wheels and tyres. These are different. They're Continentals, both front and rear, but the rears are a different age of Continental. And Alistair feels they're not quite right, and I've known this with a few different tyre brands because of various regulations and whatnot. Tyres that theoretically should be exactly the same as the ones you've got, they're not. And so that has created him a few issues, but he's working on it, and hopefully it's going to be solved soon. One of the things that I really love about this car is that if I didn't know that it was modified, there isn't really much to give the game away. On the outside, if you're a purist and you know these cars, you'll be able to tell the front bumper is subtly different. These formerly had a little black stripe running around the bottom, but this now doesn't. It's Rosso Corsa from top to bottom, and I think actually looks really good for it. But the giveaway is the big carbon fibre scoop on the side, which Alistair actually made himself and feeds, believe it or not, the oil cooler. A big part of his work for this car has been trying to make sure that it won't overheat and that it runs nicely and effectively. These cars were designed essentially for 5-star unleaded, the equivalent I think to like 105 octane or something like that. Fuel that no longer exists, put it that way. And this is a common issue for older cars, so he has done a lot of work to make sure that it's all good, nice, and isn't going to break because it's being fed unleaded. It does still, though, need very good quality fuel because during the rebuild he fitted high compression pistons, so he does on occasion use octane booster with it, although I have heard a lot of negative things about octane booster, so I personally wouldn't want to, but you know, needs must. You can't get 102 everywhere here, certainly not as easily as you could over in Germany. Inside then, the only giveaways are the more modern head unit with a CD changer behind the driver, and this Momo steering wheel, which looks kind of correct for an old Ferrari, but actually isn't. Originally, this would have had the exact same unit as you'd have found on a 246 Dino, and in fact, the entire dash layout here is also the same as you'd find on a 246. No power steering, also no lockout for reverse, which is kind of terrifying, particularly as it has a dog leg. Indicators don't self-cancel, so anybody watching this video that was following me earlier, apologies, I think I may have left one on for a little bit. I like this dash layout. The material, not so much. It does look a little cheap, although I think it is actually aluminium, but it's just However, it is of its time. It's kind of cool, retro looking. Love the classic. Now, Jack from number 27 watches these videos, and I butchered the pronunciation of this brand before. I think I said Veglia. Is it Veglia? It's probably something like that, isn't it? Veglia, I don't know.
Veglia, dials, Veglia, not Veglia. Idiota.
Anyway, let's ignore all of that. We're on a nice, fun little stretch of road. Let's see 44 years after she rolled out the factory gate, what the old girl's got. That's what she's got, the ability to put an absolutely daft grin on your face. I shall book my appointment with the plastic surgeon later to have it removed. What a machine. Now, I've actually just gotten out of what in some ways you might call this car's modern day successor. Truthfully, that'd be the Roma, but what I've actually just gotten out of is a GT4 Lusso T, which has another 400 horsepower or thereabouts on top of this. Didn't give me that smile though. Now, part of it is the fact that to go fast in this you have to work a lot harder than you do in the Lusso. That's modern cars for you. But I also love the fact that here you sit basically on the road. It feels like there's no bonnet in front of you. This gear shift, it's a little long, it's a touch indistinct for a Ferrari gated shifter, but it's actually, once you get dialed in with it, really, really nice. And then you can do this. Oh, lovely. It's also got just about the right amount of punch too. Let's get through here and we'll give you a bit of second gear. And we're off. Now the red line starts at about 7,000 RPM, but truthfully, come about 6 and a bit and it starts losing interest. But honestly, this is a good, strong, healthy engine. Picks up at about 3,500 RPM. It's noisy in here. It's not as noisy as Adrian's Mondial. The exhaust isn't standard. These never would have had a cat from the off, but it's just wonderful. The visibility is sensational. It's like looking out of a goldfish bowl. I put my narrow driving shoes on today, and for good reason, because these pedals are fairly close together. The brake is magnificent. Now, they are uprated brakes. The tyres are better than standard, and the brakes were probably marginal to begin with, so that's a very good thing. Right about now, the only thing I'm actually not in love with is the steering. Once you're into a bend, and once it weights up, it's really, really nice, and it's very adjustable. The chassis actually got a lot in it, but there is just a bit of vagueness around the dead ahead, which I do not like. Again, I've gotten used to modern Ferraris where they're very, very keen, but I can do that. And in the Lusso, if I did that, I'd be over there, then I'd be over there, then I'd be back over there again.
Subsequent to this review, Alistair managed to improve the issue with a realignment and hopes to improve it further with a set of different but now matching tyres front and rear.
I must give this car credit because it is not often that I get in something of this vintage, and let's be honest, it's a 70s car and I want to throw it around. The last car I drove like that was a Lotus Europa, and though this is a very, very different car, I've got that level of confidence in it. And that speaks as much of Alistair's work as it does Ferrari's. The reason I say this is a very important car in Ferrari history is because it is. If you've ever lusted after a Ferrari, it's probably something like a 308, a 328, probably not a 348, a 355, a 360, 430. Even if your dream car is an F8, well, if you trace the family tree of that all the way back as far as you can go, it ends here. This is Genesis for the mid-engined V8 Ferrari. This was the dry run for the 308, the Magnum car, and one of the reasons that Alistair bought this in lieu of a 308, remember 20 odd years ago they were all a lot cheaper than they are now, is because he knew this was going to draw a little bit less attention. But people that knew would know. In fact, it recently won Best Not an Alpha at a Scottish-Italian car show, which he's rightly very proud of. And I can see why. It's a lovely, lovely thing. This colour combo of the Rosso Corsa over the tan interior. Oh, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Goes well, sounds good. All right, the notion of it being a proper four-seater, it's a bit of a stretch. And that likely would have compromised the design. They've kept the flat roof to try and give you space in the back, but even so, I mean, I'm quite far forward. I'm actually a little bit cramped. I probably adjusted my seat a bit too far forward for the benefit of the clutch, but yeah, it's tight back there. It's really, really tight. You've then got loads and loads of room for luggage, which is to say nothing of the actual boot, which is also a fairly generous size. Up front, you also would normally have a spare tyre, but as that's not there, you've sort of got a bit of storage space. And I should point out that the tow rope has never been needed. Oh, I've actually also just spotted the dial still does say Dino on it. So it really is Dino gauges. I suspect it goes a little bit better than a Dino though. This is a lovely engine, and this one's very healthy. It was dynoed at 240 horsepower, the original power figure, but that was at the wheel rather than the flywheel. And those original numbers might have been, you know, Italian. So this car, massively historically important. It also has all the ingredients that you'd want from any classic Ferrari, particularly in this colour combo. Nice V8 engine, beautiful gated shifter, leather inside, prancing horse, and let's call them distinctive looks. Why then are these still languishing around at the sort of 40 to 60,000 pound mark, where the older V6 Dino with its 2 seats and smaller engine is now a 300,000 pound plus car? Is it just the looks? I think it might be. Between the looks and the fact this is a 4-seater, well, in other cars, maybe you could get away with it. But in a Ferrari? A Ferrari's got to be a looker, hasn't it? It just does. That's the point. That's why you didn't buy a German car. You wanted something pretty, you wanted something full of Italian flair, and this, I know it has its fans, but I am not amongst them. And the 2+2 bit, well, that takes away a little bit from the specialness of the whole thing, takes away from the exclusivity of the experience. But you know what, when you're sat here, you don't care about any of that. However, what you probably do care about, even if you've maybe convinced yourself this could possibly be a good idea, is the fact that these suffered from the curse of the four-door Ferrari particularly badly, to the point that you could pick one of these up sometimes, if it was really ropey, for less than £10,000. Now, that was at a time when £10,000 was a lot more than it is now, but those were needy cars, and they very, very rarely got the attention that they deserved. This one is currently up for sale at, I think, £51,500, and I know it has had far, far more than that lavished on it over its lifetime. So if you were to buy one of these, it'd be this one. And buy it, not fooling yourself, not thinking that that means it's never going to have a problem. It's an old Ferrari. They always will have some issues. They are needy things. They have never been any different. But this has had the big stuff sorted. This has also had a lot of love, a lot of care thrown its way, and it's been tinkered with by somebody that enjoys driving it. Because honestly, there's nothing riskier to buy than a really good-looking classic Ferrari that someone hasn't driven. Because those are the cars that when you go to move them, all the bolts fall out. Pristine, shiny bolts. But no good to a car if they're on the floor. This though, oh, I'd happily drive this though, 450 miles all the way home. And I know that Alistair's going to miss it, but sometimes in life, you have to move on. And for him, he doesn't have the driveway space to keep all the cars that he wants, and he's had his fun with this. He feels like it's the right time for a new owner to get it. And there are examples out there for a lot more money than he's asking, 60, 70,000 pounds, but they're not selling and they probably won't sell. And they're probably on lower mileage than this, but I wouldn't care. If you want to buy one of these and you're just obsessed with low mileage, you are a fool. Buy the one that's been sorted, because ultimately it will work out an awful lot cheaper, not just to buy, but to own. And the last thing you want is to go and buy your dream Ferrari and then worry about driving the blooming thing. What an awful, awful state of affairs that would be. And you know what? drove the 456 the other day, and I said in that video, those I think are destined to go up in value dramatically. These, they'll always be held back by their looks. They just will. And the people that grew up wanting one, well, they're getting old now. If they haven't bought one, they're not likely to. But if for whatever reason this is a Ferrari that's been floating your boat for some time, I think you should do it. Anyway, I want to say a big thank you to Alistair for coming out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.